He has around 45 published articles in both Malayalam and English to his credit. At present, he is doing his second PhD at Gyanadeepa Vidyapeeth, Pune, and is specializing on literary theory. Without further ado, may I request Dr. Suraj to begin this session on enlightenment as a meta-narrative.
Welcome, Dr. Suraj. Welcome, Dr. Suraj Pitapalli.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, teacher. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. I think
Yes. Yeah.
I think somebody has to switch off the microphone yet.
Participants, kindly note, please mute yourself during the session for clarity. So you can start now.
Okay, good. Fine. Can you see me now?
Yeah, we can see the
Okay.
lights.
Okay, fine. Okay, good evening to everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank you, and especially Dr. Anjana Shankar, the head of the Department of English, for having invited me to this platform. Today we are going to discuss about enlightenment as a meta-narrative. We all know about enlightenment as a social theory or as a literary or as a historical movement, but it has got a philosophical backup, and I would like to trace the history behind, the philosophical history behind enlightenment. Otherwise, I would not be doing justice to this theme. That's why I would like to make a very short survey of the history of philosophy that reaches up to enlightenment. You see, normally the history we do divide as BC and AD. That means the birth of Jesus Christ is the turning point in dividing history, or that's the milestone that divides history normally. That's why we have BC and AD, before Christ, and Anno Domini, or of course the year of the Master or year of the Lord. But there is a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers. He has written a very famous book. Of course, he's a great 20th century contemporary philosopher, an existentialist philosopher, but he has also contributed a lot to the philosophy of history. And in his book, The Origin and Goal of History, he makes a different uh, division in history. He says that the birth of Jesus is not that remarkable. It's not a very remarkable event when compared to certain other movements or some uh, other surges, he would say. And he says that if we divide the history into two, then the milestone should not be the birth of Jesus. The milestone should be, he calls that milestone an axis, or an axis of history, and that axis age is called Achsenzeit in German, or the axial age, and that axial age should be somewhere between 800 BC and 200 BC. And he says that the axis of history precisely goes around 500 BC. So he pushes the milestone some 500 years back. He says that the birth of Jesus is not a remarkable event when compared to 500 BC. And this axis, the peculiarity of this axis, according to Karl Jaspers, is the birth of logos or the birth of reason as a ubiquitous phenomenon everywhere in the world, no matter whether in the West or in the East, everywhere reason started its bipedalistic walk according to him. That means in the East or in China, Confucius was born and the Confucian philosophy had an influence there. And in India, Buddha and Jaina were born then or around that period. And Socrates was born, or the first philosophers were born those days, I mean, around 500 BC. Therefore, he would say that around 500 BC or between 800 and 200 BC, a remarkable surge in the history of reason took place. And because of that surge, we have to divide the history as before the axial age and after the axial age. And there is an interesting reason for that. For example, even before the first philosophers or the first scientists, I would say, there was literature. For example, Homer or Hesiod, all these writers have written great pieces of literature. When we compare their literature with those of today's great literary figures, they were also very great writers, but at the same time, their writing is somehow different from that of the post-axial writers, he would say, or the post-axial thinkers. He says that when Homer and Hesiod wrote their literature, of course, it was in a systematic way, but they had always an appeal to the supernatural. For example, when they explained the physical phenomena or the physical things or the physical causes of action, they always had an appeal to the supernatural. In order to interpret the physical reality, they always appealed to the supernatural. For example, even in Indian mythology, we have got such parallels. And in the Greek mythology also, we have got a lot of appeals to the supernatural. So the physical phenomena is explained through supernatural categories or extra-physical categories. Whereas in 500 BC, a paradigm shift took place. And this paradigm shift came with the Milesian philosophers. The Milesian philosophy, or the very starting point of philosophy, is with the philosopher Thales. It is Thales who explained the physical world with a physical thing. So he said that the fundamental element or the fundamental substance of this physical universe is water. Until that time, all the Greek people had heard about Zeus, Jupiter, Minerva, Athena, and so on. In the ancient world, for every explanation, they had gods, or they spoke about the origin of gods. For example, in Hesiod's Theogony, he speaks about the origin of gods. So, no matter whether it speaks about the origin of gods or the origin of the universe, they had always supernatural categories and supernatural figures in their literature. But for the first time in the Greek history, there came a philosopher, Thales, with an explanation, with the natural categories or the physical categories. And he spoke about water, and water is very familiar to the Greek people since they lived in islands. So water is a thing that they used every day for taking bath, to drink, and for every purpose. So for the first time in the Greek history, a physical thing was introduced for the explanation of physical phenomena. That means for the human problems, in order to analyze the human problems, in order to analyze the cosmos, in order to analyze the universe, they took no refuge in supernatural categories. Instead, they spoke about the natural categories and the natural things. So for the first time in the history, the natural things came to the forefront, or reason came to the forefront. And there begins the saga of reason. And therefore, Karl Jaspers would say that this is the axial age and this is the real birth of reason. So birth of reason is the real dividing line in history according to Karl Jaspers. And you see, after Thales, there were so many philosophers, and the most prominent philosopher after Thales is, of course, Socrates. Well, I don't get deep into the history of philosophy because it takes a lot of time. Anyway, the greatest of the philosophers in the post-Milesian period was, of course, Socrates. But as you know, Socrates has never written any piece of literature. All the knowledge we have about Socrates is through his disciple Plato. Plato has written a lot of literature, and in almost all the Platonic dialogues, the protagonist is Socrates. Therefore, Socrates is the central figure there, and the philosophy of Socrates is introduced to us through Platonic literature. And according to Socrates, the duty of a philosopher is that of a midwife. That means the truth is deep within you. For example, the midwife is not giving birth to her own child, but on the other hand, she helps the woman to give birth to a child in a healthy way. So this is the duty of a philosopher. So the truth is not within the philosopher, but the truth is in the interlocutor himself, or truth is deep within each and every one of us, but we are not capable of bringing it out. So the philosopher helps us to bring it out through conversation, through a dialectic method, through dialogue. And that method, that dialectical method, or the dialogical method, or the method of dialogue, is called maieutic. And maieutic is the term that is used also for denoting midwifery. Therefore, Socrates would say that the duty of a philosopher is that of a midwife, or philosophy is a great midwifery, according to Socrates. And in the post-Socratic period, a lot of philosophers were there. Plato was the greatest one, of course. Plato was the disciple of Socrates, and Plato's disciple was Aristotle. And Plato and Aristotle are known as the greatest of philosophers in the history of philosophy. And I would like to invite your attention to a just a minute. Can you see a PPT?
Yeah, we can see it, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay. So now you can see a painting, no? Scola di Athene, or School of Athens. Can you see a painting?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So this is a painting by the great painter, the great Italian painter Raphael. Raphael is known as one of the greatest painters. Raphael is one of the greatest painters of Italian Renaissance, and of course, Raphael, together with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, constitute the trinity of Italian art. And this is the magnum opus of Raphael. This painting, of course, it's a fresco painting. Its original was done in the Palace of Vatican, in Vatican Palace. Even today, if you go to Vatican Museum, you can find the original painting there in Vatican Museum, in one of the rooms of Raphael. And this painting is known as School of Athens. And you see, this is a very famous painting which depicts almost all the philosophers who lived between some 500 BC to 300 AD. So not all the philosophers are from Athens. Even though the painting has got the title School of Athens, not all the philosophers are from Athens. But there are philosophers from Alexandria, there are philosophers from South Italy, and so on. And the central figures of this painting are Plato and Aristotle. You can find them right now. And you see the old man is Plato. And Plato, you see Plato there as an old man pointing his finger towards the skies. And he has got a book in his hand. You can see it. And that book is Timaeus. He has got the book Timaeus in his hand, and he is pointing his finger towards the skies. Whereas his disciple or his student Aristotle is seen nearby with another book in his hand. Perhaps you can read the name there. And the name of the book is Ethica or Ethica Nicomacheia, the famous Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. So Aristotle is having his Nicomachean Ethics in his hand, and you just look at his hand. He's just pacifying his teacher, and he's disagreeing with his teacher, I would say, because Plato is telling Aristotle that the reality is up above the skies, because his finger is pointing towards the skies. That means he is telling him that the reality is idea, or the reality is up above the skies. And Aristotle is disagreeing with his teacher, and he says that the reality is not above the skies, but what you see around you is also reality. That means matter is also reality. And you see, the whole history of philosophy can be traced from these two hands, I would say, or from the fingers of Plato and Aristotle, or against the backdrop of the fingers of Plato and Aristotle, because the whole history of philosophy is nothing but the history of the strife between these two philosophers, or these the battle between idea and matter, whether idea has got priority over matter, or matter has got priority over idea. That's the central theme in the history of philosophy. So the history of philosophy is the history of the battle between mind and matter, whether mind has got superiority, or reason has got superiority, or matter has got superiority, or experience has got, or I mean sense experience has got superiority. So Plato denotes the ideal school, whereas Aristotle stands for the material school, or the sense experience school, I would say. And this strife between Plato and Aristotle continued even in the medieval period, and also, of course, in the medieval period we don't have much examples of this great battle, but in the modern period we find this battle revisited, or revisiting the philosophical circles or the academic circles. And the modern philosophy is by and large dominated by the strife between, or the battle between, rationalism and empiricism. The father of rationalism, the French philosopher René Descartes, he said that there are two substances. One is res extensa and the other is res cogitans. Res cogitans means the thinking thing, or mind, simply mind. And res extensa means the extended thing, or matter. So he says that there are two substances, and the superior substance is mind, and human being is actually a mental substance. Of course, he has got an extended body, he has got a body, but still ultimately he is a mind substance according to René Descartes. Then, of course, his rival in England, John Locke, he would say that experience is prior to mind. That means René Descartes famously said that you are born with some ideas or some knowledge deep within your mind. So you are born with some inborn ideas. He would call them innate ideas. And according to his theory of innate ideas, a human being is born with a capital of knowledge. So within his mind, at the time of his birth, he has got a certain amount of knowledge, and that amount of knowledge is understood by the term innate ideas. Whereas his opponent John Locke would say, no, it is not possible. Nothing is in the mind which is not first in the senses. So in order to have a valid knowledge, in order to have any knowledge at all, you must have an experience. So you are born with a tabula rasa. You are born with a clean slate, or you are born with a blank piece of paper. So your mind is just like a white sheet of paper. Nothing is written on your mind. Nothing is in your mind. You have got no capital in your account. So in order to acquire knowledge, you must have sense experience. So the matter is very important. The priority of matter is again emphasized by John Locke, whereas René Descartes would say that mind is prior, or mind has got priority because it has got some capital within it at the time of birth. So this strife or this battle also went on. I mean, the battle between continental rationalism and British empiricism, it went on. The main proponents of, or the main figures of continental rationalism were the Frenchman René Descartes, of course, the father of modern philosophy, or the father of continental rationalism. Then, of course, the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Then the German philosopher Leibniz. Whereas the British empiricism went on with three other figures. One was an Englishman, John Locke. Then the second one was an Irishman, George Berkeley, and the third one was a Scottish man, David Hume. And at the time of David Hume, the whole philosophy actually crumbled down. The whole philosophy shattered because of the attack of David Hume. It is David Hume who famously introduced the Hume's fork, which is known as Hume's fork in the history of philosophy. He famously said that from an ease you cannot necessarily jump into an ought. For example, I would tell you one thing. You see, the day before yesterday, or even from time immemorial, sun rose in the morning every day, isn't it? Sun rose in the morning every day. Yesterday also the sun rose in the morning, and today also the sun rose in the evening, in the morning. But can you categorically say that the sun would rise in the morning tomorrow? Are you sure about it? Can you say that? No, we cannot. We cannot say, because we are not sure about what would happen tomorrow. We are not sure about tomorrow. So from certain contingent facts, all those was or is facts, all those things were, according to Hume, contingent facts. Out of these contingent facts, you cannot build, you cannot construct a necessary fact. That means there is no jump from an is to an ought. There is no jump from an is to a must. So without a must, without an ought, there is no theory. For example, when you state a theory, all the instances must hold true according to that theory. That means in order to construct a theory of knowledge, a valid theory of knowledge, you must have certain sureties. You must have a surety. You must have certain certainties. So without that must factor or ought factor, you cannot construct any theory validly according to David Hume. Therefore, according to David Hume, out of these contingent facts, you cannot build or you cannot construct a theory, and no theory is therefore possible. If no theory is possible, no valid knowledge is possible. And that position is called the Humean skepticism, or the doubtful position, I would say. Skepticism, you know its meaning, no? So according to Humean skepticism, no knowledge is possible. So actually David Hume has bulldozed all the claims of knowledge. He has actually bulldozed all the claims of knowledge. So the reason is helpless. Reason is useless. There is no point in having the brain in your head. There is no use of it. You cannot use it because as an agent of knowledge, reason is very poor. Reason is bankrupt, I would say. As an agent of knowledge, reason cannot claim any knowledge at all. If it cannot claim any knowledge, then it is bankrupt. So as a bankrupt faculty, reason is helpless. That's why the next philosopher, the philosopher from Germany, Immanuel Kant, he started a new task, or he has actually shouldered up the Herculean task, I would say. He has shouldered up the Herculean task of emancipating philosophy from the clutches of this skepticism, or the Humean skepticism. He said in 1781, he published his first critique, which is known as the Critique of Pure Reason. And in the preface of Critique of Pure Reason, he claims that Now, reason or metaphysics, if he uses the term metaphysics, metaphysics was the queen of all sciences, or I would say knowledge or philosophy in general. Philosophy in general was the queen of all sciences, and she was like the Queen Hecuba of Troy. The Queen Hecuba of Troy was a very majestic woman, but after the war, she was captured as a captive, and then she cannot enjoy any power. She cannot dominate anyone. She cannot command any power. Therefore, she is in a helpless position, and he says, Immanuel Kant says that now the philosophy is also like the captive queen Hecuba. She weeps. Now I will have to reinstate the queen uh, in the throne. I will have to recrown the queen again. I will have to recrown the queen. So in order to reinstate the queen metaphysics, he started up his philosophical career, and he published the Critique of Pure Reason. And in Critique of Pure Reason, he says that even though reason cannot claim everything prior to experience, reason can claim certain things even before the experience. For example, according to René Descartes, the human being or the human reason is born with certain ideas as capital within the mind. Human being is born with certain innate ideas, but he would say that even though all the ideas are not innate ideas, the human reason has got certain innate capacities to acquire knowledge. But he asked, to what extent? He says that we cannot claim, we cannot make some superficial claims, or we cannot make some hyperbolic claims about knowledge. Instead, we will have to delimit the claims of knowledge. So we have to make a survey of the capacity of reason. To what extent can reason claim knowledge? That was the fundamental question that Immanuel Kant raised. Then he says that, of course, there are certain things which are knowable, and there are certain things which escape the capacity of reason. And those things which fall under the capacity of reason, he called such things phenomena. Phenomena is the plural of phenomenon, and those things that escape the capacity of reason, he called them noumena. It is the plural of noumenon, thing in itself. So he says that even when you have knowledge, you cannot have a complete knowledge of things, or you cannot have a complete knowledge of the complete scheme of things. Therefore, your knowledge is limited. If your knowledge is limited, your claims to knowledge must be humble. So you must be humble. Your reason must be humble. So when David Hume said that no knowledge is, David Hume said no knowledge is possible, he said knowledge is possible, but with a reservation, with limitations. So with limitations and reservations, knowledge is possible. That was the position of Immanuel Kant. But the revolutionary change that Immanuel Kant brought in philosophy is that he could regain the confidence of reason. According to Immanuel Kant, the Hume's position was just like that of a guillotine. That's why he says that Hume's philosophy is Hume's guillotine. So with his guillotine, Hume beheaded philosophy, the claims of knowledge. Hume has actually beheaded all the claims of knowledge, all the claims of reason. But with Immanuel Kant, the reason is proved that the reason is again proved capable, or reason has got certain capacities. If reason has got certain capacities, then the confidence of reason is regained, quite natural. And if reason has got certain capacities, and if reason can claim some knowledge, then with that confidence, you can say that a rational life is a good life, or a rational life is the best possible way of life. That's why he proposed rational life as the best possible way of living. And that is what we see in enlightenment. So I was actually giving a very short introduction to enlightenment, because enlightenment is a Kantian term. It was Kant who wrote a famous essay Was ist Aufklärung? In German, its title is Was ist Aufklärung? Its English translation is What is Enlightenment? He wrote this essay in 1784. As I told you earlier, in 1781 he published his Critique of Pure Reason, and within 3 years he gained some confidence in the capacity of reason, or he himself had the confidence in the capacities of reason, and with that confidence he wrote in 1784, 3 years after, he wrote the essay What is Enlightenment? And according to Kant, enlightenment is the Kantian definition of enlightenment. Let us just move to Kantian definition of enlightenment. According to the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, the motto of the enlightenment was sapere aude. If your reason has got capacity to know, then dare to be wise. Dare to know. That is his motto. Sapere aude. So the motto of enlightenment is sapere aude, or dare to know, or dare to be wise. Have the courage to use your own intelligence. That is what Immanuel Kant says in his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? So, according to Kant, enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. So, Immanuel Kant says, you have got your own reason, you have got all the capacities, you have got, you are literate, you can read books, you can understand books, but still your capacities are limited in the sense you are guided by somebody else. Somebody else makes a backseat driving for you. So you cannot freely use your reason. So start using your reason freely. Once you start using your reason freely without any constraint, then you will have the courage, or you will have all the capacities and abilities to break the chains. And this motivation actually gave energy to his French counterparts, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and Montesquieu. And 5 years later, in 1789, the greatest human, I would say, the greatest humanitarian surge took place, and that surge was French Revolution. So French Revolution is actually a fruit of French Enlightenment, which is I would say, which is an offshoot of the German Enlightenment of Immanuel Kant. Of course, Immanuel Kant had a great influence on the French philosophers, and the capacity of reason, the confidence in the capacities of reason, all these things have contributed to Enlightenment and French Revolution. So this this essay was published in 1784, and even though no revolution took place in Prussia, in Immanuel Kant's own land, the revolution took place in France. So Enlightenment, since Enlightenment could produce a great human movement through the form of French Revolution, this French revolutionary spirit, it diffused in the whole of Europe through the expeditions of Napoleon Bonaparte. Because in the post-revolutionary period of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, he made a great expedition, and he has actually given the Enlightenment spirit and the French revolutionary spirit to the whole of Europe. And you see, therefore, reason, the Enlightenment spirit, and rational life, all these things became the most desirable way of living. The most desirable way of living was a rational life, and therefore Enlightenment became a meta-narrative or a big story. Then, when I use the term big narrative or meta-écrit, its French term is meta-écrit, and it is translated as meta-narrative or big narrative or grand narrative or big story. This meta-écrit is actually a story that functions as a story whose narration functions as explanation. So if I am asked to define a meta-narrative, I would say A meta-narrative is nothing but a story or a narrative or a narration whose narration functions as explanation. That means you are not supposed to ask any further question. For example, there is a famous scientist, Paul Davies. He is an Australian scientist. He has written a famous book, The Mind of God. In the introduction to The Mind of God, in the beginning of that book, he would narrate his own childhood days. He says that he used to go to outdoor plays, go for outdoor games after the school. When he comes back after the school, sometimes he would go for outdoor games, and some days his parents would tell him, they would say that you are not supposed to go today. Then he would definitely ask the question, why I cannot go? Then they would say, no, today you cannot go because there is possibility for rain. Then he would ask a further why there is possibility for rain. Then they would say, well, the weather prediction is so you are not supposed to go. Okay, then he would ask a further why. Then of course he would ask a further why. So he has got an unending concatenation of whys, or he has got an unending chain of whys. But the explanations have got a limit. So the parents cannot explain everything. So towards the end, when they come to a position where they cannot give further explanations, they would appeal to the supernatural. In the same way, in the very beginning, we were discussing about the categories of the supernatural, or the supernatural language and the supernatural categories. So they would appeal to the supernatural. They would say, finally they would give an answer, because God willed it so. That's it. That's the answer. Then Paul Davies cannot ask any further question. Paul Davies cannot ask any further question because God willed it so. You cannot ask any further question when it is God's will. So you are appealing to a narrative, you are appealing to an explanation, or you are appealing to a story that a story whose narration functions as explanation. So you don't need to explain further. You just narrate the story, or you just tell the narrative, then that's enough. So such stories are called the meta narratives, or grand narratives, or big stories. So enlightenment became a big story. That means in the whole of Europe, the people thought that a rational life would constitute a successful life. So a rational life is the most desirable way of living according to the European model. So in the 19th century, people always thought that a rational life is the best life. And all these things, this confidence in rational life, confidence in reason, confidence in the capacities of reason, all these things again shattered towards the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century. For example, even when we speak of the human beings as rational animals, through the First World War, the human beings proved that they are just brutes. Even though they have got rational capacities, these rational capacities and rational abilities do not help them. They are merely brutes. So the human beings are slowly starting to lose confidence in reason again. So they are starting to lose confidence in meta-narratives or big stories. That is what we find in the beginning of the 20th century. That's why we find a big, I would say, a great example of such a thing in the literature of W.B. Yeats. In 1919, W.B. Yeats published a poem, The Second Coming. In his Second Coming, he says that turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Of course, the next sentence is very important. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. You see, the center cannot hold, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. That means a narrative cannot hold all things together. That means the centricity is lost. the centrality is lost. So this world is losing its central narrative. No matter whether it is a religious narrative or a scientific narrative or a philosophical narrative or even an economic narrative, all the age-old narratives are losing their hold. That means no narrative can hold the people together. For example, you see in the 19th century we have got at least 3 big revolutions. One is the Darwinian Revolution, which took place in 1859 through the publication of On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. That means the human beings are not the central beings or the central organisms in this world. We are nowhere. We are just some products of a chance evolution. We are just the products of some chance evolution. For example, in the religious narrative, we have heard that man is created in the image and likeness of God. He is a created being. He has got a key role in this world, but no key role in this world is given to him. He is just like any other organism, and he is just a product of the chance evolution, or he is just a product of evolution which is governed by chance. So the Darwinian the theory of evolution, it actually nullified age-old meta-narratives, age-old philosophical and biblical, or I mean religious narratives. Then in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they published the Communist Manifesto. According to the Communist Manifesto, you are determined not by your consciousness but by the material things. So the material searches of human beings, they are very important. They determine the human beings. The economic cravings or the financial cravings of the human beings, or the selfishness of the human beings, they are very powerful, and they are even more powerful than the consciousness. So matter determines the consciousness. It is a famous statement by Karl Marx. Matter determines the consciousness. So the material things, the matter, it determines the consciousness. So you are not governed by your consciousness. Even though René Descartes said that you are a mental substance, mind is the superior substance. No, mind is not the superior substance according to Marxism. So according to the Marxian revolution, or with the Marxian revolution, the things turned once again upside down. Things turned once again upside down. So 2 revolutions are already there, and the 3rd revolution comes. The 3rd revolution is the Freudian revolution. Sigmund Freud would say that you are more governed by the unconscious than by the conscious. So you are not governed by your governed by your consciousness. You are governed by certain unconscious drives. So the unconscious has got a big grip upon you, or the unconscious has got a great power on you. Therefore, you are governed by the unconscious. So the unconscious. So you are not the master of what you do. So you cannot claim any mastery over your deeds. You are governed by the unconscious drives. So with the Marxian revolution, Freudian revolution, and Darwinian revolution, almost all the meta-narratives that the people put trust in shut down. Now the people are no more in a position to believe any of the meta-narratives. That's why W.B. Yeats writes that the center cannot hold, things fall apart. And another example is found in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, because he starts the Wasteland with a very revolutionary statement. April is the coolest month. Of course, April is not the coolest month. You see, April is the adolescent month of, I would say, the adolescent month of spring, which is the best of all seasons. There are 4 seasons, and spring is said to be, or spring is generally regarded as the most pleasant season. Therefore, April must be the most pleasant month. For example, when we move to the wee hours of English literature, you see in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales starts with a praise of April, when that April with his short suit, you see, when April with its sweet-smelling showers. So he starts with a praise of April. He praises April. The month of April is praised by the first the first writer, Chaucer, in Canterbury Tales. Or when we move to William Shakespeare in his As You Like It, he says that men are April when they woo, December when they wed. Maids are May when they are maids, but the sky changes when they are wives. So in the Shakespearean literature, in Geoffrey Chaucer, or I mean in the beginning of English literature and in the classical period of English literature, we find praises of April. That means April is considered as the best month, or the most desirable month, or the most agreeable month, I would say. And in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, the things are turning upside down. And in Wasteland, he starts with a very strange statement: April is the cruelest month. So in 1922, you see, 1922 is a period after the First World War, and 1919 is, of course, just after the First World War, and it was also a period of pandemic, I mean the Spanish flu, and all these things have exerted a great influence upon the writers, and they thought that we cannot trust any meta-narratives more. So the lack of trust in meta-narratives, that is called the modernism. So the modern spirit, or the modernism, is actually the lack of trust in meta-narratives. And still they entertain the hope, I would say they entertain the hope that sometimes some other meta-narratives would revisit, or some other meta-narratives would replace the age-old meta-narratives or the shattered meta-narratives, or the meta-narratives would come back again and they would rule the world. But in the post-modernism, after modernism, there came post-modernism. In the post-modern period, the post-modern writers said that no more meta-narratives are going to visit this world again. No meta-narratives are going to come back. So the gone meta-narratives are gone forever. No more meta-narratives are to be expected. So the age of meta-narratives is over. So that is the central theme, or the central characteristic we find in postmodernism. So modernism is actually a lamentation over the lost centricities and the lost meta-narratives, but still they entertain the hope that sometimes they would come back. Some other meta-narratives would revisit. But in the postmodern period, we cannot entertain any hope in meta-narratives. No more meta-narratives are going to visit this world. So the age of meta-narratives are gone. Therefore, postmodernism is defined by the famous French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard. Simplifying to the extreme, he published a book, Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. In that book, he defines postmodernism. Of course, it is not very easy to define postmodernism, but still he defines postmodernism in this way, and he says that, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards all meta-narratives. So I don't believe any meta-narratives more. I don't believe any meta-narratives. So this belief in meta-narratives is the central characteristic of postmodernism. And you see, this postmodernism, actually this postmodernism has given birth to a lot of what we call short narratives, or petit écrit, according to the French literature, or the French, because its original was in French, and according to the French philosophers, now the meta narratives are replaced by some short narratives, or petit narratives, petit écrit, you would say some short narratives. So the short narratives are right now replacing all the meta narratives, and meta narratives, just like mythologies, they have also got their essence in its telling, and it is said by another philosopher, German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger, in his famous essay Was heißt Denken, or What is Called Thinking, in 1952, he says that myth is that which has its essence in its telling. So all the meta-narratives have got their essence in their own narration or in their own telling, and we cannot expect any meta-narratives more. So we will have to find out our own ways. So in art, in literature, in science, then in philosophy, in religion, and everywhere, you will have to find your own ways. There are no more umbrella narratives. There are no more meta narratives. So no one can say that this is the umbrella narrative, this is the foundational narrative, or this is the big story to which all have to conform to. No one can insist that. Therefore, for example, this is a famous building which I visited in 2012. It is in Germany, in Abensberg. It was actually designed by an Austrian architect, Hundertwasser. Of course, even in Vienna, you can find certain buildings of Hundertwasser like this. And you see, this is also a building, and this is a strong building. Even though you would be even though you are doubtful about the strength of this building, I would reiterate that this building is strong like anything. It is really strong, but its structure is a bit ovary, or it's a I would say it's a bit ovary. But anyway, you see, Hundertwasser is actually showing us, or he is telling the world that you can also build a building. It is actually a brewery. It's a brewery that belongs to a brewer in Bayern, in Bavaria, in Abensberg, and Kugelbauer. Kugelbauer is the name of that brewery, and this is a brewery in German. They call it Brauerei. And you see, this is another building in the same brewery, and you can also see people sitting there and drinking beer. So this is a brewery, and you see, from the traditional point of view, we cannot accept this as a building, but still it's a building. And you see, this also, we cannot accept it as a building. For example, when we speak about a room, we always think about 4 walls, 4 corners, and so on. But here, you would not find such things. Or even in Malayalam, we would say that kattilayal 4 kaalu venam. But it's not necessary here. Even with 3 legs, you can build a cot. It is not necessary that a cot should always have 4 legs. So, the traditional understanding of things are turning upside down with postmodernism. And this postmodernism is the new narrative. Postmodernism is not a narrative, because postmodernism cannot put trust in any narratives. Therefore, postmodernism as such cannot become a narrative. But this postmodernism promotes a movement against meta-narratives, and it promotes short narratives or shorter narratives. And again, we go back to the French literature. There we would find some French writers. Of course, we won't discuss about Emmanuel Levinas, because Emmanuel Levinas has his contribution in ethics and metaphysics, whereas Jacques Derrida and Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, these 3 writers have their contribution in the deconstruction. Of course, Jacques Derrida is the father of deconstruction, and they promoted this kind of philosophy, the philosophy of shorter narratives in the French literature, and also, of course, in the European literature. Therefore, deconstruction proper is actually an accommodation of diversity. So in order to accommodate the diversity, you will have to find out the diversity deep within any structure. For example, you see, in the beginning, we discussed about the fight between mind and matter, or in the very beginning, we discussed about the fight between mythos and logos, or the supernatural and the natural. For example, we brand the literature of Hesiod and Homer as mythology because they have got an appeal to the supernatural in their explanations of the natural things. But when we move to Socrates, or when we move to Thales, or when we move to Anaximenes or Anaximander, then we have got natural explanations for natural things. So they have got an appeal to the natural things. So there is a fight between the supernatural things and the natural things, or there is a fight between myth and science, or there is a fight between mythos and logos. So the fight between mythos and logos, that is the first binary in the history of philosophy. Then of course, in the history of philosophy, we also found the fight between mind and matter, or idea and experience, or idea and senses, or mind and matter, I would say. And Jacques Derrida, in his, the title of his famous book, De la Grammatologie, in French, and in English it is called Of Grammatology, and it was translated from French to English by an Indian writer, Chakravarti Gayatri Srivastava. And you see, deconstruction is actually dismantling the binary opposites. When you analyze a social situation, when you analyze literature, when you analyze religion, no matter whatever thing you analyze, after your analysis, you will come across an opposition of binary things. You will come across I would say, you will come across a catch-22, or a situation where two opposite things are joined together. And Jacques Derrida names them as privileged and marginalized. So in every analysis, you will find a dichotomy between the privileged and the marginalized. So when you apply this deconstruction, you will always come across the battle between, or I mean the opposition between the privileged and the marginalized. So in order to have a proper analysis of the society, in order to have a proper analysis of literature, you will have to employ deconstruction methodology, and through deconstruction methodology, you will find the binary opposition deep within the heart of reality. For example, I will just tell you an example. I would narrate an example from Bible, because Bible can also be seen as a literature, because it's a piece of literature. And you see, for example, in Bible, we have got a famous narrative about a woman caught for adultery, isn't it? A woman caught for adultery. Certain Jews came to Jesus with a woman, and they said to Jesus that she was caught in adultery, she was caught red-handed, and now she must be punished. So what punishment should we give her? That is what they ask. And Jesus tells them, well, you can punish her, but at first you have to think about yourselves, and if you have not committed any crime or any sin, then those who have not yet committed any sin, let them stone her at first. And all the men went back. They went away. They couldn't stone her. Why? Because adultery is a sin or a misdemeanor that a person cannot commit alone. One needs an accomplice. One needs a partner to commit adultery. So the title, I think the title should be changed then. It is not the story of the woman who was caught for adultery, but the story of men who were caught for adultery. So towards the end of that story turns to be the story of certain men, or a lot of men caught for adultery, because all those men who came there, they were also partners of that crime or that sin or that misdemeanor, whatever name you give. So that is deconstruction. So in the Jewish society, the men were a privileged class and the women were always marginalized. That's why they gave the title, the woman caught in adultery. Actually, it is a story of the men caught in adultery, or the men charged with adultery, or men caught for adultery. But because of the male chauvinism, or the patriarchal flavor of the society, the story was given the title "Woman Caught in Adultery." So, in the same way, I was just telling you an example of literature, and you see, likewise, you can also apply deconstruction to analyze any of the social situations, any of the philosophical concepts, any of the scientific theories. You see, that is the real power of deconstruction according to Jacques Derrida. And Derrida would say that this deconstruction, or the dismantling, actually this is not the dismantling, the term that we use is deconstruction. Deconstruction is a positive word, I would say. It is not mere dismantling, but we are actually making a careful analysis of the fundamental structure of reality, in order to know the fundamental structure of reality, or the structure of a literary piece. And you see, when we move to certain other philosophers, I mean, to Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze, then we will find certain other examples of this deconstruction. Then they would say that the meta-narratives, all these meta-narratives, or the age of meta-narratives, have created the society in a tree-like way. They would say that when we have got a meta-narrative dominant in a society, then we would explain all the aspects of human life with the help of meta-narrative. For example, if somebody asks a capitalist about the pandemic, about COVID-19, of course, he would start with COVID-19, or with the coronavirus. Then, of course, later he would move to some problems of world economics. Then finally he would end up with his analysis of the society with a capitalist flavor. If you ask a communist, if you ask a Marxist, then he would make a Marxian analysis, or the Marxian analysis of the society functions as the central theme, or the fundamental theme for almost all the aspects of life. In all walks of life, he would employ Marxism as the interpretation tool. So, in the age of meta-narratives, we would depend upon one or other meta-narrative to explain the society, to explain all the phenomena. But when we use such meta-narratives, or when we depend upon such meta-narratives, we are actually using a tree-like model, or we are developing a tree-like model of society. For example, in a tree, you see all the branches, they have got a connection to the root. So the root, the meta-narrative functions as the root. So for each and every explanation, you have got a connection somehow to the root. So the meta-narrative always governs the particular activities and even the particular developments in the society. So in every walks of the social life, the meta-narrative has got an impact or influence. Therefore, as the root of the tree governs or influences the branches, the meta-narrative influences the society. So in an age of meta-narratives, the society is just like a tree. Therefore, the tree-like society, they would call it arborescent model, or arbor. You see, arbor is tree, and in French. Therefore, they would say this is an arborescent model. So an age or a society dominated by meta-narratives is an arborescent society, whereas a society which is governed by petty narratives or short narratives, they are just like rhizomes, or they are rhizomatic society. And they would say, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari would say that tree is the villain. In the modern society, tree is the villain. When you seek an explanation with the help of meta narrative, then you are going to do. You are going to end up with failure. You are going to end up in failure. Whereas you will have to find out your own narrative. You will have to depend upon your own narrative, where you don't depend upon any other narrative. You don't care for the narratives of others. So you have to find out your own way. Therefore, they would say that potato, for example, take potato. Potato has got a lot of roots, and there is no central root. You see, no root can claim that I am the central root, you all depend upon me. No root can claim so. So tree is the villain and potato is the hero, according to Schildelius and Felix Guattari. And you see, an example for this rhizome is there in our society also. We are very much familiar with the cassava, I mean tapioca, and you see, even in tapioca, you don't find any central root. All the roots or all the branches have got their own individuality and independence. No root can claim, or no branch can claim that it is the superior one, or it is the foundational one or fundamental one. So this rhizomatic model is the model of society, proposed by the modern philosophers and the modern writers. That's why in the postmodern age we find a lot of literature that goes, sometimes we would say that that grows over, or that goes astray, but that's not the way of commenting upon such literature. Actually, they are taking this path, or they are using this way of narration, or this way of approaching things. That means my narrative has got its own importance, and for my narrative I need not depend upon any further narrative or any bigger narrative. So today's literature, today's art, today's philosophy is by and large governed by this rhizomatic model, and this rhizomatic model is the model of postmodern literature, I would say. So through deconstruction, actually you are entering into the dichotomy between the privileged and the marginalized. Of course, you cannot turn it upside down. For example, Jacques Derrida, he doesn't say that the privileged should be made marginalized, no, or the marginalized should be made privileged, no. He doesn't speak about that. On the other hand, deep within the reality, deep within the social facts, there is such a dichotomy, or there is such a binary of opposites, and you have to understand that binary. And when you understand that binary, you will understand that all these things are certain constructs, certain historical constructs. Power has played a very important role in constructing such things. Therefore, you have to understand that, you have to recognize that, and you have to perhaps get away from the meta-narrative style of explanation of things. Well, I think right now I can wind up this thing, and then perhaps I can respond to your questions. Otherwise, it would be monotonous, I think.
Thank you so much, sir. So that was indeed an enlightening session. So now we are open for your questions. So the participants, if you want to clarify your doubts, please do turn on your video and also unmute yourself, and you can ask the questions. Any questions from the participants?
Should I mute my microphone right now?
No, it's okay.
So this is from C Lounge. Thank you, sir, for that beautiful. You traced it very wholly. I've personally read a few articles of yours on post-truth. Would like to hear from you from where this trajectory of truth has taken us in this world of post-truth. Thank you, sir. Sir, you have muted yourself.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, fine. Thank you. You see, Kalna teacher, good evening. You see, post-truth is actually an offshoot of this postmodernism, I would say. You see, the contemporary philosophy is not monolithic. It is a mosaic, I would say. For example, post-structuralism has got a leverage on postmodernism, and postmodernism has actually influenced almost all the philosophical movements or the philosophical developments of 20th century and even the 21st century. And of course, you see, if you go back to the 19th century, Nietzsche has also influenced a lot in the development of the postmodern philosophy, because it is he who made the best attack against the first meta-narrative, because according to him, the biggest meta-narratives that the world has ever seen were that of Socrates and Jesus Christ, and he made an attack on Socrates and Jesus Christ. And even in his philosophy, or even in his literature, he says that truth is a construct. Truth is a construct of these two men, he says, Socrates and Jesus. So that should be deconstructed according to, of course, he doesn't use the term deconstruction, but according to him, the truth constructed by Socrates and Jesus must be attacked. And he made an attack against the concept constructed by Jesus and Socrates. And that's why he says that now we have to take a new path. That's why he defines philosophy as nitimur in vetitum. That means to strive for the forbidden. Until now, certain things were forbidden for us. Certain paths were forbidden for us. Certain ways were forbidden for us. Now we have to tread on those ways, and this capacity or this audacity to tread on the forbidden paths is the new task of philosophy according to Nietzsche. And he defines philosophy also as nitimur in vetitum. To strive for the forbidden is philosophy. And you see, when we move to truth as such, you see, truth is a metaphysical property, or a transcendental property of being. Like being, truth cannot be fully understood. It cannot be fully analyzed or fully imbibed. And you see, even in Immanuel Kant, he says that the full truth is beyond human capacity. We can have a knowledge only about the phenomena, the appearance, and the noumena, or the thing in itself, always escapes the human rational capacities. Therefore, truth must be something beyond the rational capacity. You see, even, for example, when we speak about God, when we speak about truth, when we speak about beauty, you see, all these things are beyond our comprehension and beyond our capacity. For example, after Immanuel Kant, there came a philosopher, Hegel. Towards the end of his philosophy, he speaks about a triad that ends up as the culmination of his culmination of the philosophical development. There he speaks about the subjective mind, the objective mind, and the absolute mind. And this absolute mind has got a further triad of development. They are art, religion, and philosophy. And you see, in art, you seek beauty, and in philosophy, you seek truth, and in religion, you seek God. So what you seek as God in religion, and what you seek as beauty in art, and what you seek as truth in philosophy, all these three things are same. And he would say that truth is the culmination and it is never fully accessible. And if you are interested, perhaps you can also get to the literature of Soren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher. Of course, he is also a great literary figure. He says that truth is not an objective thing. And he says that truth is an objective uncertainty. He says in his concluding unscientific perspective, in his book Concluding Unscientific Perspective, he defines truth as truth is an objective uncertainty held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness. That means truth is subjective. For example, when you have got a relation or a connection with truth or a passion for truth, you are more guided by your subjective passions. You cannot give any objective justifications for that. For example, even for the religious truths, even when the believer says that he believes in such and such things, or when he says that he is cocksure about the content of his faith, he cannot convince others. He cannot give full justification for his faith. So therefore, if truth is subjective, if it is not fully accessible, then of course there is scope for the shades of truth, and such shades of truth have given birth to this post-truth age. Of course, the human intervention is also there. Man is manipulating the shades of truth. I do admit that, but still, the subjective incapacity to comprehend truth fully is the foundation for post-truth, I would say. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
To hear you, my question is, are the scriptures like we may, for example, Indian scriptures, especially Ramayana and Mahabharata or Ramcharitmanas, are these to be considered as memory literature? Number one, if they are memory literature, how far they accommodate diversity, or they are the source of enlightenment? Do you think in any category they fall in, or you keep them beyond? Or because if they are beyond, then they are not pieces of literature. And if they are really to be analyzed, then they can be considered as memory literatures, and then you're exploring, investigating the characters in it.
Okay. You see, then it would depend upon how we define literature. For example, when we encounter the world, we have got an experience of the world, or we experience, for example, you see, the first literature is actually the fruit of human encounter with the world, no? The human being was taken by the gigantic nature, or the depth of the world, or as Blaise Pascal says, the silence of the world, and so on. So the gigantic universe, it had a grip upon the human mind, and he creatively responded to this universe. And from that response, there emerged either mythological literature or philosophical literature or even science. For example, when he started to understand the underlying principles governing the physical universe, there started science, isn't it? Even today, what do we mean by physics? Physics is nothing but understanding the physical laws governing the physical universe. So through physics, we are actually getting near to the laws governing, or the principles governing, the physical universe. And the same physical universe is explained with the help of certain supernatural categories or supernatural glossary in mythological narrative. For example, in every religious narrative, in every religious literature, there are a good amount of mythological narratives or mythological components, I would say. And you see, as far as its emancipative twist or liberative twist or enlightenment twist is concerned, I would say enlightenment is concerned with liberation, no, or emancipation. You see, when we move to the 20th century literature more, and the more concretely, I would tell you the name of a philosopher, a German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas, he speaks about 3 domains of knowledge. He says that at first you can make an analysis. For example, knowledge can function as an analysis. Then knowledge can also function as interpretation. So these are the first 2 stages or the first 2 domains of knowledge according to Jürgen Habermas. And he says that the most creative domain of knowledge is emancipation. For example, when you get a drop of water, you can make an analysis and you can say that 1 molecule of water consists of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Of course, it's an analysis. And you can also speak about the forms of water or how water exists in this universe in various forms and so on. So you can make also an interpretation. But at the same time, this water is a potential element for war, isn't it? The people predict that, or even the experts predict that perhaps the Third World War would be for water. So water can become a casus belli, a case for war. So when you understand that, you can even change your mode of thinking and your approach towards using water. So the same knowledge can sometimes liberate this world. So knowledge should always become liberative. Of course, it's a twist put forward by the so-called New Left in. New Left is also associated with Antonio Gramsci. Well, it's a very complex theme, but still the New Left school within the Frankfurt School or the critical theory.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So there is a question in the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah, can you throw some, I'll read it for you.
Okay.
Can you throw some light on post-human condition and how the rhizomatic model of subjectivity works?
You see, the rhizomatic, of course, as I told you, for example, let me tell you a very, very neat example. Some years back, for example, I completed my 10th standard in 1993 when we studied literature. I mean, Malayalam literature or English literature, of course. About English literature, those days, you see, we were not concerned about the so-called Vruttam, Alankaram, and so on. But in Malayalam literature, we used to learn the Vruttam and Alankaram. And today, when you get a modern, a postmodern or a contemporary piece of poem, either in Malayalam or in English, most probably they are no match for, I say, even when I use the term no match, it is with limitations and reservations because I am not in a position to compare. But anyway, today we are not at all concerned with such Vruttams and Alankarams, isn't it? So whatever comes out of your imagination is a piece of literature. That is literature. So no one can dictate that this is literature and this is not literature. No. Anything that is feasible can be considered as literature. Anything that you find feasible can be considered as literature for you, because you are guided not by any meta-narrative. On the other hand, you are guided by your own petty narrative, your own short narrative.
There was another part for that question. Can you throw some light on post-human condition?
Yeah, you see the post-human condition. You see, post-human condition actually must throw some light upon. Philosophically speaking, it must throw light upon the famous Nietzschean and Sartrean philosophy. Of course, it has got its roots in the Sartrean and Nietzschean philosophy. It is Nietzsche who said that the human beings have to take a new path, or they have to dangerously deviate from the traditional ways. That's why he always urged the people to live dangerously. That's why I told you earlier that according to Nietzsche, philosophy is nitimoving vetitum, or strive for the forbidden. So you have to move through the forbidden paths. That means the history has placed upon you certain or a lot of expectations. A lot of expectations are on you. History has put a lot of expectations on you, and you have to conform to such expectations. For example, a human being should be so and so, a student should be so and so, a professor should be so and so. Otherwise, you will just terrorize the people. If you get out of that traditional way of doing things, then you will just terrorize the people. And you see, in order not to terrorize the people, you will have to conform to the pre-described or the pre-designed path, or the copybook style of living. And Nietzsche is the first man who rejected it. And then, taking energy from Nietzsche, Sartre would say that the human condition, or the human essence, he calls it, of course, l'être pour soi. He distinguishes between being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself is the frozen essence. That means the sum total of the expectations of the society. I would define l'être en soi as the sum total of the expectations of the society. So the society expects a lot of things from you. At the time of your birth, a lot of expectations are on you, and the society has given a list of do's and don'ts, and now you will have to conform to that copybook style. But Nietzsche would say that Sartre would say, no, you are freedom. He doesn't say that you have freedom, but he says that you are freedom. That means the human essence. If there is something called human essence, actually he denies human essence. That's why he has got the title of his magnum opus, Being and Nothingness. Being and nothingness means being and no essence. That means being and being alone. Existence and existence alone. Existence and no essence. That's the title. An analysis of the title would render such a statement. That means you have got only existence and no essence. So no matter whatever load of expectations is on you, you are not supposed to conform to such expectations. You have got your own way, and you have to continuously revolt against. He doesn't use the term revolt, but he says negate. You will have to continuously negate this load of expectations, and through negating what is expected of you, you are becoming what you are. And towards the end of your existence, what you become is the essence of you. So your essence is not a prefabricated or a pre-designed one, but it is a thing that you become towards the end of your life. So no one can speak about a human essence until and unless a man finishes his life. So in the post-human condition, actually they also use the same philosophical analysis. You see, what is expected of a human being, the traditional narratives about human beings, such things are denied in the post-human condition, or in the post-human theory. Actually, you see, even when we use the term post-human theory, or when we associate the postmodern literature or postmodern philosophy with some isms and ologies, actually I would say it is not correct, because you cannot associate any postmodern thinking with any ism, because it is a continuous revolt against isms and ologies. Because through isms and ologies, you are actually making a mold. And postmodern condition, or the postmodern philosophy, is actually a continuous or an ongoing revolt against molds copy books, then the pre-designed models and so on, or the so-called meta-narratives. So even the term ism or ology would mean another meta-narrative. Therefore, to be a real postmodern philosopher, please refrain from using the terms isms and ologies. That's my suggestion.
Thank you, sir.
So we have another question. How do you relate Buddhist theory of impersonance to meta-narrative and deconstruction?
You see, the Buddhist concept of impermanence, no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Buddhist concept of impermanence is something connected with metaphysics. You see, that means no essence. He speaks about that means the reality is ephemeral. Buddha would say. That means it is just a fleet of what we find as reality is just a fleet of appearances, and out of these appearances you cannot construct a true essence. That's what Buddhism says. And in the postmodern, he was asking a question about. Could you just repeat the question?
How do you relate Buddhist theory of impersonance to meta-narratives and deconstruction?
Deconstruction. Okay, fine. You see, and meta-narratives. Of course, there was a period where we had such meta-narratives, and actually, Buddha is the first one. You see, Buddhism and Jainism both are atheistic religions. We know that they are not theistic religions, because in the Indian system of philosophy we have got the Astika systems and the Nastika systems, and Buddhism belongs to the Nastika system of philosophies. That means it doesn't accept God, or it doesn't. I don't say that it doesn't accept God, because even in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism, the people consider Buddha as God. But Buddhism as such does not admit any God, and Buddhism does not also accept the prominence or the authority of Vedas. Well, leave it. Anyway, Buddha was a champion philosopher who fought against meta-narratives, I would say. That means in a period, you see, in the 5th century BC, in a period where people thought about human essence as a sacrosanct thing, he said that there is no essence. Essence as a sacrosanct thing, he revolted against it, and he denied it, and he said that there is no essence. What we have got is just a fleeting experience, or a changing ephemeral experience. In that sense, he was the first Indian philosopher, I would say, who revolted against the first or the most sacrosanct meta-narrative. That is the relation between Buddhism and meta-narrative as far as this question is concerned. And deconstruction is actually, you see, out of such meta-narratives, when these meta-narratives lose their ground, then we will have to go for a deconstruction, because then we will have to find what is wrong with this meta-narrative. Then in the deepest core, you will find the binary of opposites, and then you need not turn it upside down, or you need not invert it, but at the same time you will have to understand that there is an impasse. Of course, he uses the term aporetic. That means you cannot go beyond. It's an impasse. It's a catch-22, and in such a situation, in such a confused situation, you cannot go beyond that. Therefore, you will have to admit the limit of the limitations of analysis, and then you will have to act accordingly. That is what deconstruction says.
Sir, hope you'll have a time for one more question.
Okay.
Ma'am, may I ask a question?
There is another question from in the chat box. There is another question from Dr. Anjana Shankar. How is Immanuel Kant say, what is enlightenment different from Michel Foucault's essay by the same name. But okay, just a minute. Content-wise, from a philosophical point of view, you see, for Michel Foucault, you see, about the enlightenment of Immanuel Kant, we have discussed a lot. Now, Michel Foucault is also a postmodern philosopher, and you see, Michel Foucault is also associated with Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and he was a close associate of Deleuze and Guattari, and he actually associates everything with power. There are two great philosophers, or two famous philosophers in the 20th century who spoke about power and hegemony. One is an Italian philosopher. He was a leftist thinker, Antonio Gramsci. He speaks about hegemony, whereas he speaks about power. And for him, power is what we call, he actually doesn't define what power is, Michel Foucault. But he says that, you see, in order to have dominion over the course of actions in the society, you will have to create a group of people, or you will have to create a species that sees power as a desirable thing and the subjugation as a desirable thing. For example, when we live in, when we are living in slavery for some 12 years or 15 years or 20 years, sometimes we even lose the appetite for freedom. And actually power creates a kind of sympathy towards the obstructive, or the so-called what we call the people who hold power, and the people who really put you under your power. For example, when you are under surveillance, he uses the term panopticon. For example, in a prison, we have got a system called panopticon. In a panopticon, there is a watcher, and that watcher can watch the whole prison, and he can see all the developments, all the things that are happening in each and every cell. That means, in a cell, a person who lives in a cell, he is well aware that he is closely watched by the person who is in the panopticon, or he is watched by the panopticon, or he is watched by the watcher. And after a certain amount of period of time, he would just conform to that system. That means he is adjusting himself to power. So there are certain agents of oppression, or say certain agents who are wielding power on you, and you are actually getting into an agreement. He doesn't use the term agreement, but you are actually becoming at home with that power. And power has got such a capacity to make those people who are under power feel that they are at home with power, to feel at home, to make them feel at home with that power. And you see, if power has got such a capacity, then actually the enlightenment is the release from this clutch of power, according to Foucault. So for Immanuel Kant, it is also the release from self-incurred tutelage, but for him it is the release from the imprisonment of power. But you see, tutelage is also a power. Tutelage is also a power, because it is self-incurred, and according to Foucault also, it is self-incurred, because you are feeling at home. Towards the end of your imprisonment, you are feeling at home with that power, with that oppressive structure. And if you feel at home with that oppressive structure, then it is a kind of self-incurred tutelage. In that sense, there is similarity between Kant and Foucault, I would say. So for Kant, actually, it is something connected with knowledge and rational capacities, whereas for Foucault, it is purely in connection with the political power and the social oppressive structures. But of course, knowledge is also associated with it. We can connect knowledge with it.
So, am I able to
Thank
hear
you,
me?
sir.
Am I audible? Hello,
Yes,
am I audible?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, you are.
My question is, with all these existentialist philosophers speaking about, they are deconstructing things. They say that there are no absolutes. So, what do you think? What does the future hold? What do you think that where does this world moving towards? Like, people talk about the past a lot, but where do you think the future? What would be the future of this world that people in itself, without a strong absolute to lean against? With I mean, if there's and then the meta narratives that are going against the grand narrative, then even there's an identity. There's an identity that comes to those who are following a narrative that is going. Where do you see all of this? Like, do you think there will be a crisis in identity and individuality?
Yeah, that's a good question. You see, uh, actually, today the world is also speaking about a postmodernism. That means of course, postmodernism says that the lamentation that modernism made is a perennial lamentation, and you are not going to get any meta-narratives back. The gone meta-narratives are gone forever, and you are not going to retrieve them. That is the position of postmodernism. But today, there is another movement that is growing in Europe, which is called postmodernism. Of course, we don't have much literature concerning postmodernism, but anyway, it is also a nostalgia for meta-narratives. That means today, you see, even politically speaking, when the people move towards far right, today, for example, in Europe, in America, in Russia, or in Turkey, either in the name of religion or in the name of race or in the name of ethnicity and so on, the people tend towards far extreme right, isn't it? And this movement, this oscillation towards the far right, I would say it is a kind of nostalgia for meta-narratives. For example, for a racist, the superiority that comes out of race is a meta-narrative. For example, for Hitler, Rasse und Raum, or race and space, that motto was his meta-narrative, that the Aryans were the superior race. So even today, when I observe the oscillation towards far right, it's a kind of it's a slight I would say a slight shade of movement towards meta-narratives or nostalgia towards meta-narratives. And as you expressed, we all are concerned about the lack of meta-narratives. But at the same time, we cannot entertain much hope in the coming back of meta-narratives, because the world is so constructed today, and or the world is so constituted today that no more meta-narratives can hold the people together. Sometimes it can hold a group of people together. Sometimes it can hold a nation together. But in order to hold all people alike, I don't expect any meta-narrative more. But without meta-narratives, actually, it is very difficult for people to lead a meaningful life. I do admit that. I do agree with you. But how do we give the people a meta-narrative? Most probably, sometimes, you see, you might have come across the book of Yuval Noah Harari. Yuval Noah Harari has written a lot of books, and you are familiar with many of his books, like Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for 21st Century, and so on. And in Sapiens, he says that humanism, for example, religion, from he starts with animism, from animism to polytheism, from polytheism to monotheism, and from monotheism it has to grow to humanism. Perhaps humanism must be the meta-narrative of future. it must function as the meta-narrative of future. But in order to take, or in order to admit humanism as the new meta-narrative, we have to grow a lot beyond the shells of nationality, nationalism, religious sentiments, or the caste sentiments, the race sentiments, and so on. But if we can grow to such a meta-narrative, then of course it's a sensible growth, I would say, and it can be promoted. But without a meta-narrative, as you mentioned correctly, without a meta-narrative, it is not very easy for the common man to live, and that's a crisis today, and we do see that as a crisis.
Thank you so much, sir. So it's already getting late. So let's just wind up the session. Are there any more questions?
Thank you, Suraj sir. Thank you for your very enlightening session. It's related philosophy with the latest trends in literature. Thank you. Any more questions?
Okay, so let's guess there aren't any more questions. So now I invite Ms. Lakshmi Ashok, research scholar, Sri Shankara College, Kaladi, to propose the vote of thanks.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
So good evening. The great American thinker and scholar Emerson says, scholarship is to be created not by compulsion, but by awakening the pure interest in knowledge. I think Dr. Suraj Pittapalli has really awakened our pure interest in literary theory and philosophy. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on this topic with your profuse knowledge. And the area has got vast scope, and the webinar is an eye-opener for many, especially the research scholars. So the way you explained different concepts and the way you clarified the doubt, it shows how articulate you are on this topic. And thank you so much for this insightful session. Once again, on behalf of the Department of English, Sri Shankara College, Kaladi, I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, I would like to thank Anjana ma'am, HOD Sri Shankara College, Kaladi, for her guidance and support. I also thank all the faculty members, organizers, and my fellow research scholars, and all the participants for making this webinar a grand success. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi. So with that, we have come to the end of today's session.
Pittapalli sir, could you please post your mail ID? Please,
okay.
Could you give your mail ID if any of the people want to? Please, could you put it on the chat box, in the chat box?
Okay. Just a minute.
And for the participants, the feedback form is posted in the chat box and also in the WhatsApp group. So before leaving, please do fill it up.
So thank you for putting up your email ID, sir. I hope you won't mind if any of the participants wish to correspond you over email.
Okay, no problem.
I know you would be very glad to disseminate your knowledge.
Okay. And if you are interested, you can also get in touch with my articles through academia.edu. Academia.edu. Suraj George Pittapalli. Then of course you will find a lot of research articles published there, and you can freely access it. You can even download them.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Like the poetry of historicism, even historicism, history of philosophy of history, and so on. The Hegelian, Collingwood models of philosophy of history. All those things are there, and even certain write-ups in contemporary philosophy, especially those of Félix Guattari and Schilderus, all those things are there. Sometimes you will have to find out them from my literature, but anyway, you can get them.
Again, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, teacher. Thank you, Anjana teacher. Thank you, Mincy.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
So
Anju.
we look forward to meeting you all again on 27th August at 6 p.m. with another resource person for our last lecture of the series. Thank you all, and thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you, teacher.